Welcome to the conversation.
All right, welcome to this new podcast. It's recorded especially for the issue 6 of the Conversation magazine, which is coming out in iBook. I didn't tell you that yet, Duncan. Anyway, I'm joined by Duncan Yeates, who is an assistant principal at Mounts Bay Academy. And so, Duncan, we're going to have a conversation, first of all, about why we educate children in the first place. What do you think about that?
Okay, well, I'd like to start with an anecdote, really. As a student I taught last year, who asked me, he was a capable student, and he asked me what was the point in doing GCSEs, and that's the kind of thing that a lot of students say as a response to find something difficult, find something challenging, and they question the nature of it. But this was really from a student who was capable of doing extremely well, but he hadn't really connected up, or he was unable to see the connection between GCSEs and any other purpose. And I kind of thought about it and tried to give him a really respectful answer rather than, it's just what you've got to do. And I kind of ended up explaining to him my position, and it made me think a lot about the nature of education, really, that GCSEs are really something that the government's decided that it's beneficial for students to learn, that they serve as a way of rank ordering students on the criteria the government consider to be useful to their needs, and that they are, in some senses, there's a sort of intrinsic political quality to them that is quite problematic, I suppose, in some senses, because, for instance, in English, we teach novels from people who are primarily Victorian, white, heterosexual, essentially, though they wouldn't have had this notion in the era, middle class, and that's been decided upon. And so we are telling students that good literature looks like this. And it got me thinking about, if you were completely contrary to that point of view, and you say, oh, well, I'm not going to, then you're not supporting students to achieve their very best. But it's a contradiction, because you're trying to educate them to potentially pass an exam, but there's a whole load of things that go around that, which I think I want to acknowledge more. I'm interested in acknowledging more.
Yeah. I can see what you're saying, but I think there's probably like a distinction to be made between the value of education in and for itself and the choices that governments and the political context, the choices that they make in terms of what we teach them, isn't there? Essentially the curriculum. But also the value that society places on, for example, subjects like maths and English, and to a lesser extent science. So, for example, we say that, essentially to have passed your school career, you have to have a decent grade in maths and English. But that's a societal choice, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's a form of it's a form of rank ordering, which is expedient to what the government want to do. So prior to this discussion, we were sort of talking about how you could trace it far back enough. You've got monks being able to read and write because they understand the word of God, or they're allowed to write it down. And then they can educate all the in speech marks plebs about what they need to know, but they can't read and write anything.
But that's very much about control, isn't it?
Yeah.
So they essentially put the plebs, they put the common people, under the fear of God, and I'm not going to say invent, but you have notions of hell and hellfire and damnation. And they're the only ones with access to the holy text because they can read Latin, they can read and write, they transcribe the books, copy the books, and therefore they're controlling the population because they're saying, right, these are the rules, this is what the Bible says. But what can you do as a member of the common person in that situation? You can't exactly opt out of the whole of the way society operates at that time.
This is what's interesting, because the conversation culminated with this student where I said, okay, we can argue, and I can give you an argument where I can say it doesn't matter. But if I did that to you, it's a fraudulent decision because I then place you outside of everything that occurs. Yeah. So your input is completely you've written yourself out of the whole construct. So you can say it's a construct, and it's, I'm doing GCSEs to do A-levels to do a degree to get a job. But then if you say, well, doing none of it, you place yourself in a position of vulnerability in first instance, because that's how we decide to operate as a society. And secondly, you place yourself in a position where you have no meaningful contribution to make because you've made no attempt to engage with the rules of engagement, I suppose.
Yeah. But all right, so that begs the question then. So somebody outside of that system doesn't have any meaningful contribution.
Well, it presupposes...
Couldn't.
Well, yeah, well,
is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not saying that they don't. It's a really good question, isn't it? Because that's the implication of what I'm saying. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is if you to have in our where we've structured our society to have a position of influence, education is associative, isn't it? With it. So it is no coincidence that a large number of our prime ministers have all been to Oxford or Cambridge. There is a certain cachet that does go with that.
There are, in Boris Johnson's cabinet, 64% were publicly educated,
and a huge number. I think half of our loads of our previous PMs have been Oxbridge, haven't they? Or even the opposition has been Oxbridge. Yeah. So that's interesting. And so I suppose where I ended up arriving in this conversation, which I think is worthy of further discussion, is that you sort of a bit like with writing a poem, you've got to know the rules to break the rules, haven't you? Yeah. And so I think I made my peace with this kind of, in a sense, but it's worthy of further discussion. I think there's two parts of education. There's a part where you say, this is how you get a GCSE. Now, you've got a GCSE. This is what it needs to do next. And this is why it matters, because if you want to make a difference, you've got to engage with this system. Yeah. But you also need to be sitting down with yourself and saying, I'm doing this, so I get this GCSE, but I also see what the system is and how I'm operating within it. Otherwise, I'm just a victim of it, possibly.
Yeah. No, I can see that. And I would bring that back to discussions that we've been having here, and I know schools across the country are having in terms of curriculum, which seem to me sometimes slightly disingenuous, because we could say, oh, yeah, we're going to be the designers of our own curriculum. Yeah. But at the end of the day, we've got to get the kids ready to sit an exam that isn't decided by us. It's decided by exam boards, and you can choose an exam board, I know, but do you know what I mean? The government lays out what they get. So ultimately, I guess the only way out of that would be for a school to opt out of the exam and teach kids what they think is the best in their subject, or rather, the best of what humans have thought and felt, and the conversations that humans have had over the time. So, I sometimes struggle with curriculum design and the fact that schools say, "Oh yeah, you're autonomous to design your own curriculum." Well, I don't think you are. It's a very rigorous, very tight constriction, isn't it? Within which we can design our own curriculum.
I entirely agree, and I think my kind of anxiety is that a big push in school is to try and to get students from maybe disadvantaged backgrounds to perform extremely well. But then one of the things Chomsky says, and he's right, is you take these students that are disadvantaged, let's say they get straight 9 grades, they get straight A grades, they go to Oxford University, they get in 30 grand of the debt, and they work for the man, they work for the corporation. So all this agitation, all this context they have for their own upbringing, their own successes, they're not born into a context where it's expected from them they're going to go to Oxford and become a doctor or whatever. They've got a different perspective, and a different perspective is that the agitation is really healthy, but so tied to that, I think we need to make sure all students have a kind of awareness that they are operating within part of the system, and to be complicit with the system, but complicit with critiquing it as well. Otherwise, my anxiety is...
And possibly we're putting them into a place where they are agents of change in the future, possibly. Yeah,
quite possibly. But they need to understand the duality, that that they do what they're asked to do to be successful, but that equally is just one expectation, and when they've achieved that expectation, they can then choose to innovate as they see fit.
I was at a meeting yesterday where this Professor Blandford, she's called, who's written 45 books. She's been an educational researcher for 34 years. She knows what she's talking about. She was telling this story that she had a twin sister who, she said this publicly, so I hope it's all right. I don't think many people can listen to this anyway, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, a twin sister didn't do very well at school, so left kind of without many qualifications, got a job at the very lowest level, I think, for British Airways, something like that. Worked for most of her life, and I think something like 50, took redundancy, whatever. And then only then actually had the inclination, for whatever reason, to go back to education. And fast forward a few years, has just graduated, I think, with a master's in fine art, or graduated with a degree in fine art. And now, as twins, they're able to have conversations where the professor, who's obviously worked at a very high level of educated life and academia for a long time, has seen a complete change in her sister's ability to appreciate and live a completely different sort of life, simply from the fact she is now sort of more educated. And by that I mean has had her eyes open to different ways of seeing the world, or at least the ability to, she called it a level of criticality, in terms of analysis of the world, or observation of life, and in particular arts. Obviously, that's what she was studying. So, again, really, my point that I'm trying to make there is obviously we have to get kids through GCSEs in order to allow them to become agents of change within the system.
Yeah, which is what I'm saying. Yeah, absolutely.
But surely there is a part of education where it's valuable for its own sake, simply to free somebody from the shackles of ignorance that they would be festooned in before. Do you know what I mean?
No, I completely agree with you.
To live a better life, not because they know about the quadratic equation solutions or anything, but actually because they just know more stuff.
Yeah.
They appreciate art. They know some literature. They have an idea about how to critique literature. They know some about how the universe works. They can do basic skills in maths. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I absolutely agree. And if education works properly, they're given, say, 7 or 8 starting points in 7 or 8 academic disciplines that they can then choose to take further forward, aren't they? And I think I just think it gets me thinking about the importance of that. I think that creative tension in my own practice. So, like, I was teaching Inspector Calls today, and I spoke to them about quite a lot of stuff which wasn't directly relevant to answer an exam question, but I was considering about getting to consider the fact that really the play itself is a piece of political propaganda to promote socialism, which, as an avowed Labour voting socialist, I agree with, but actually it affects the quality of the writing in the play, which makes it quite shoddy. It's quite the characterisation is quite two-dimensional. It's in its own way, it's a victim in its own agenda. Yeah. The writing becomes subsumed to the political message. Yeah. Now, that's not something they particularly drop on their GCSE, but it was a really good thing to have that conversation, because it actually does inform the GCSE, because it's that wider, broader thinking, but it's actually getting them to view writing as something that they don't have to think is sacrosantly brilliant because it's put in front of them. Yeah. And I think
they've all been famous for 100 years.
Yeah, everyone's always done it, so it must be brilliant. Yeah. And I think that level of critique, I think, is really important, and I just think that we need to make sure that students have that. I mean, I know that Samuel Johnson says something along the lines of, you won't read one Shakespeare play without finding a fault in it, or wishing it would end a bit earlier. So that dialogue was happening at the time in academic circles of someone like Shakespeare, or post him. Yeah. But then we need students to be having that dialogue. Here's a book, but we've got to study it, and you've got to write, and you can write these things to get the top grade in it. But they need to decide if they're any good or not me.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. We were talking a little bit about cultural capital, and you mentioned that the canon of literature is mostly white English men. Yeah. From at least the upper classes, even not middle class as well sometimes. But I've been thinking a lot about cultural capital and reading Bourdieu and people like that. So what's your feelings about that? Or what's your opinions about that?
I think cultural capital is really important, because I think that it's, first of all, it's social mobility, because it's being articulate and being knowledgeable about certain things gives you access to society in a way that without it you don't have it. But I also think it's very much something that's predicated on class. Yeah. And so if you're a child who is read to, if you're a child whose parents have lots of books, if you're a child whose parents takes interest in the news and has a political opinion, either way, you're naturally engaged with that. And if you're not, it's not there. Yeah. And I think that although cultural capital is something that can easily become like GCSEs and will rank ordinary people according to their class rather than their natural intelligence.
Yeah. I mean, my worry is sometimes the value that we put on what Bourdieu calls the habitus of different class groups. However you want to split society out, it's clear that there are different, groups within society, right? Each one of which Bourdieu has habitus, which are the tropes, the argot, the language that they use, the things that they place value on.
Yeah.
And one thing that really troubles me, and I've come from a middle class family, both parents are teachers, had lots of books at home. Didn't want for anything. And therefore, I do place value, middle class value, on the literary canon of Shakespeare and and all those things. But my point I'm trying to make is that different class groups will obviously place value on different things. But who's to say which value system is the correct one?
Well, quite, and that kind of links back. Yeah.
So, but going back to the difficulty with that, then is we're saying that you have to know about Shakespeare in order to be socially mobile, or the cultural capital that we're trying to give kids essentially is, because of the way we set up schools, is middle class and upwards capital, cultural capital.
Yeah, we're almost trying to socially engineer children to be more middle class than they necessarily are.
That's my point.
But then the contradiction implicit in that is social change comes potentially from being not part of the establishment and being slightly outside it.
Yeah.
And so therefore you get an entry ticket and you say, well, I've been outside this a little bit and I don't think this is that great.
Yeah.
And I'd like to change these things.
Yeah.
And you have to wait to do it. And there's that inherent contradiction. I mean, there's an interesting book called, it's quite dated now, but called Radical Tragedy by Jonathan Dollymore, where he argues that it's a bit of I wouldn't say I completely agree with it, but he argues that basically, in essence, this is a very simplified argument, that all the best writers are homosexual because they are out, because especially date is in one's pre-1800, because they are outside society. So they're looking in, they see it, but they're not involved in it. And they skewer it a lot sharper than someone who's in it. And I think, I've not got an answer to this, but I think it's a really interesting conversation, the tension between being outside something, gaining entrance to it, but then do you become complicit with it? Do you challenge it? Can we help kids arrive at their own balance with it?
And that's very difficult for me as somebody who is always has been middle class.
Yeah.
Yet, I can see the difficulties in the systems that we have. But at the same time, am I the best placed person, even from a background, to kind of try and engineer or facilitate those changes that are necessary for that? Do you know what I mean?
No,
whereas somebody else might, like you say, coming from outside might be better.
It's kind of become a game of identity politics, where it's like, can I do something if I don't? But then that's really I find that notion problematic. That if I'm middle class, if I identify as middle class, I can't understand what it's like to be anybody else. But you have got to acknowledge that you've had a set of received experiences, haven't you, that have shaped what you are, and what you think, and what you value. And
one can be empathetic, but one hasn't lived through it.
No.
Do you know what I mean?
And there's little vestiges of class status. If I make it quite personal, so my dad's a self-employed builder who's dyslexic, and he would not be an appreciator of literary canon in any form or want to engage with it. But ever since I've known him, and he's always read. Yeah. He doesn't read what I would consider to be highbrow literature, but he's always been a reader. My mum is a much more intellectual character. And she was like, it was like giving me stuff like D.H. Lawrence to read when I was younger. So I had those two opposing things. But my dad, despite being a reader, is quite anti-literacy and anti-writing because he finds it so hard. So I've had a little bit of that experience, but not at the level where both parents are saying to me, look, you don't want to read books. You don't want to do that. What do you do that for?
Yeah. See, that's the problem. And in fact, I haven't actually written it, but one of the pieces I'm writing for this issue of the conversation, the title, get this, is going to be Reading as Emancipation.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of playing with the idea that actually, if you don't engage with any sort of dialogue, and that could be conversation, but I'm kind of putting it in the frame of the context of reading for, talking about literacy. If you don't engage with other people's ideas to reading or conversation, there's no way that you're going to possibly change your mindset from wherever you are. So if you're essentially enslaved to your own ideology within the context of that. So if that's from, let's say, the southern states of America, that's a particular viewpoint that, we obviously we stereotype and whatever. But, a lot of people that are massive Trump supporters, we look from every and think, how on earth can you be like that? But actually, I wonder how many of them actually read different viewpoints or engage in actual dialogue with other people, in a constructivist way. And so, again, my point is that, unless we read, we're going to be enslaved. And actually reading and the dialectic is emancipation for our minds from our own ideology.
I entirely agree with you, and I think
that's good because I'm writing an article about it.
But I do because I think that the one thing that we can do is, one, we can encourage a culture of reading. But when that's established, the other thing we can do, especially when we move into adulthood, is to encourage to what I've done actively for the last maybe 10, 15 years is read against type. Yeah. So I read things that are contrary to my viewpoint. Yeah. I might even find, in some sense, offensive because I'm trying to empathise with that point of view. Because the danger of the left is, just like the right, that you become what the world calls a liberal fascist. You demonise the opposing viewpoint. There's a joke that you get that you're working class when your TV's bigger than your bookshelf. Well, that's a really horrific piece of stereotyping, and it makes a lot of implicit assumptions about someone who identifies that way. Yeah, and so actually you need to expose yourself to different voices. I remember reading a really good article about a Christian guy who read all Richard Dawkins' books. Yeah, because he wanted to say, okay, I don't really agree with the word of this, but what's he got to say? What's his argument? Exactly. Yeah, and then it doesn't mean that he suddenly goes, oh, I don't believe in God anymore, but you actually acknowledge as a counter argument. Yeah. And I think too often the political left and the political right make us political, but it could be anything. Look to have their own viewpoints reinforced. Like everyone says,
well, it's the echo chamber. The bubbles in which we travel in social media.
Everyone always says, I don't know anyone who didn't vote Remain, or I don't know who didn't vote Leave, because all your mates are going to be like you, aren't they? So
this brings me back to, again, what I've written about for this issue of the conversation is really looking at the ideological foundation for why I do the conversation as a project. And it comes back to this group of people I know you know about called the Situationist International. The Situationists. And they were a group of essentially French, come out of France, but French intellectuals and philosophers.
Guy Debord, isn't it?
Guy Debord and people like that, who were around in the 60s. They very much put the sort of theoretical background to the 68s, to the Soissons Retards, and all that kind of stuff. But they were essentially anti-authoritarian Marxists, and they had some disagreement with some of what Marx said, but essentially they were very much looking at capitalism as responsible for a lot of the ills that they saw in society, particularly the alienation and isolation of individuals because of things like commodity fetishization and what Guy Debord called the spectacle, which is where, actually society itself has become an image, not a real thing. Reality has become a spectacle. And so what they engaged with was lots of things, but two famous ones. One was detournement, which was kind of turning around advertising slogans against, big companies and commodities and objects and stuff like that. And the other one was the derive, which is, and the reason I'm getting to that is that for me, the conversation, essentially, as a project, in the magazine and even this conversation, are acts of I don't know if this is a French word, but derive, acts of doing the derive, which is where they would sort of aimlessly, essentially, this is one way to do it, aimlessly wander through a city with no actual purpose, but just experience the situations that they encountered, and that's why they were called the Situationists.
Yeah, I can remember reading loads of things about Debord, like he'd go for a walk and wander in every bar he came into for one day, and then just wander out again, and then just would just behave in such ways, and and I think that's, I think it's kind of like open yourself up to jamming the programming, really, isn't it? In some senses, how I always see it. Yeah. Like looking at what the kind of cultural expectation of a successful day or successful, they just derail it completely. And I think,
well, and bringing back to the modern times, how much of political talk is framed purely in terms of the economy. Do you know what I mean? Everything's about the economy, isn't it? What Brexit's going to do to the economy, what leaving's going to do for the economy. Which political party can be trusted with the economy. Yeah. And I was having a chat with a student this morning, actually. In fact, you popped into it, I remember it. But I was trying to explain that actually for some people it's not necessarily the most important thing, is it? Because that, again, the fixation on the economical things, and the economy is a big thing, is purely a product of what Mark Fisher would call late capitalism. Because that's the only thing we're worried about. And if the economy's growing, everybody's going to be fine. And, it's all about that. We've got to keep working. But actually, if you take a step outside of that and do these things like derive and detourment and actually view society as a spectacle, you can then start to say, well, hang on, what is important?
Yeah.
I think conversations like this, where you just sit down and chat to a chum about whatever, they're important, and they alleviate and palliate the isolation and alienation that people feel as a result of capitalism.
I completely agree with you, and also in itself, economy is a construct. It's something we've invented, and then we put this primacy on it, like it's the be-all and end-all, but people could survive out an economy in a fashion. It's not necessarily what I want to live in. I'm not sure how I would feel about it.
Yeah.
But it's stepping outside things, isn't it? And looking at them and being, I think, and that's something that seems. I feel like we've recurred this conversation that we're talking about having one foot in one camp and one foot in another camp, and it's like I'm involved in this, but I'm also looking at it. And I think that's something that I think for me as a practitioner, I'm starting to place more value on. I just think it's saying to children, be brilliant, but look at being brilliant and what being brilliant is, because otherwise it becomes the definition of brilliance. And
also teaching them about placing value on things that are not necessarily commodities or money based, or placing value on things like experience and art and reading a good book. Do you know what I mean? That's an experience in itself, isn't it? That's a real situation where, again, I'm writing this issue about standing in front of this incredible painting called it was called Cancer, and also Red Sun by Huguette Colland. And just standing in front of this painting, it's just an incredible experience. And hopefully I'll try and get that across in the article. But, do you know what I mean? I appreciated it, and I could get things out. It was just incredible.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly. And you've sort of brought something else to mind, which is kind of indirectly related. It's about having a kind of confidence in your own judgment. So, like, I was thinking what you talk about French people. Arthur Rimbaud is probably one of the quite serious figures of 19th century poetry. I mean, one of his later poems, he said something along the lines of, I'm not going to quote the French because I don't know it, but he says something like, I found the figures of the exalted figures of literature and poetry ridiculous. I like children's songs, things that, and he starts listing this adverts, street slogans. He lists all these things he thinks are literature. And I think, it's no coincidence this guy was this phenomenally good poet because he had the capacity to challenge the established notions of the day of what was so good, and then say, I actually don't like any of that. I'm going to do my own thing. And he happened to be brilliant enough to make something of it. And so if we don't get people to have that engagement and that ability to criticise something, I think they're disempowered.
But you also have to have some level of expertise in order to do something completely different.
You do.
Whereas it's a completely different thing to say, I don't know anything about poetry. So I'm just going to do this.
No,
and I'm going to say, in this modern world, I'm going to self-promote and self-promote. Say, this is brilliant.
And I would argue as a poet that we have reached a point where there is a fetishisation of people that know nothing about poetry, write poetry, and say, and somehow they're brilliant because they're accessible. And I find that problematic hugely.
But that's what the modern world of social media is. They're not social media platforms. They're publishing platforms where people can write their own 180 character tweets or whatever it is, or, do you know what I mean? And get their own voice out there and think they're amazing writers or social commentators. And, no, man, you're not.
No,
you're just, you're some blokes out watching the TV shouting.
And that's where, I suppose, cultural capital education comes in, because you know what's been said, you know what's supposed to be the best that's been thought and been said. You've got it all there. You've read and opposed yourself and looked at the contrary viewpoints to yours. You've got to a place where you've got informed opinion, haven't you?
And you can justify why you've reached that because you know.
Absolutely. So, I like to go back to my point. I can justify my point in respect of cause as a person because I've read enough politicised writing to have to have an opinion on what I think are its flaws. But otherwise, it's not an informed opinion, is it? And so that's interesting too.
Definitely. Well, it's Friday evening. Rugby World Cup tomorrow. Let's call it a day there. Duncan, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.